A Great Argead Saga Alexein, Alexander the Great. Volume 1, Telesias, The War Dance. By Macaulay Naki. Episode 36, Anatomy of Slaughter. The battlefield was a tapestry of cooling iron and silence, the heavy scent of ozone and iron still clinging to the air. As the sun dipped low, painting the Haliacmon in hues of bruised purple and dying gold, a small, resolute group gathered near the center of the field. Iphicrates, Parmenion, Attalus, and Ismenias. The clatter of hooves announced their approach before the riders themselves emerged from the haze. At the head rode Philip, his armor stained with the day's labor, his features set in a mask of hard-won composure. Eurydice did not wait for the horses to fully halt. She pushed through the line of guards, her composure finally shattering into raw, maternal relief. "Oh, my boy, you are back!" she cried, her voice trembling as she reached for him, her hands brushing the dried blood on his breastplate. "What a triumph! It is a miracle. You have saved Pella." She turned, her gaze sweeping over the generals, Iphicrates, Parmenion, Attalus, and Ismenias, her eyes alight with the fire of a queen who had seen her son survive the impossible. Eurydice followed close behind, her anxiety finally lifting, her own tears mirroring her mother's as she embraced Philip, burying her face against his shoulder. Iphicrates stood at the periphery, his arms folded. The boy survived, he mused, his gray eyes assessing Philip with a newfound guarded respect. He didn't just survive, he dictated the terms. That charge was not madness, it was a pivot. Parmenion watched the scene with his characteristic silence, his heart heavy with a strange, burgeoning pride. He has the mark of a ruler now, he thought. The boy who rode out this morning is buried in the mud of this valley. What has returned is a commander. Ismenias, the Theban, leaned on his spear, his brow furrowed. A 14-year-old who lures an army to its death and returns to praise, he thought, his disdain long since replaced by a cold, calculating awe. He has eclipsed them all today. Attalus, however, simply beamed, his hand resting proudly on the hilt of his sword. "My prince," he thought, a smile cracking his scarred face. "You are the blood of the Argeads, and you have finally found your steel." Perdiccas stood in the deepening shadows just behind the group, his presence almost entirely overlooked. He watched his younger brother in the center of the spotlight, the praise of the seasoned generals, and the weeping, desperate joy of his mother surrounding the boy like a crown. A sharp, jagged clarity pierced the king's heart. He looked at Philip, a boy of 14, who had walked into the mouth of the abyss and returned with a usurper's ruin, and then looked down at his own palms, clean, steady, and entirely untested. "He is my brother," Perdiccas realized, his internal voice echoing in the hollow space left by his own inadequacy. "But he is also the standard against which the nobility will measure my worth until the end of my days." He observed the subtle shift in gravity, the way Iphicrates, a man who bowed to no one, now inclined his head toward Philip, and how the battle-hardened Attalus looked at the youth not as a charge, but as a commander. The throne felt heavier than it ever had, not because of the burden of the state, but because of the sudden, suffocating realization that he had been playing at sovereignty while his brother had been forging it. Perdiccas made his decision in the chilling quiet of that blood-soaked evening. He would no longer be the king in the shadow. From this day forward, he would be the king of Macedon who could command, who could bleed, and who would face the impossible with the same chilling resolve Philip had just demonstrated. He forced his face into a mask of jubilant pride, an act of statecraft, a calculated insertion into the circle of power. He would not be the one to fade away. He needed to be the king, and he needed to be Philip's brother, tethered to the rising star. "Brother!" Perdiccas called out, his voice ringing with a manufactured boisterous warmth that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You have achieved the impossible. Our father, Amyntas, and Alexander, our ancestors themselves, must be looking down from the heights, swelling with pride at your name." Philip didn't immediately respond. He was caught in the terrifying, sensory aftermath of the charge. The adrenaline that had propelled him through the lines was now a poison in his veins, leaving his senses vibrating with a restless, agonizing intensity. His mind was unnervingly clear, a razor-sharp, cold expanse, but beneath that, his emotions were numb, a gray, hollow void. Deep inside, a primal, jagged terror fought with a boiling volcanic heat. His hands, hidden by the heavy leather of his gauntlets, were trembling with a violence he could not suppress. "Philip," Eurydice whispered, sensing the sudden hollow stillness in him. Philip opened his mouth to reply, to accept the mantle of the hero they were thrusting upon him, but the world suddenly tilted on its axis. A violent, sickening shift tore through his consciousness. The voices of his mother and the generals dissolved into a high-pitched metallic whine, and the blood-soaked field melted into a thick, suffocating white mist. His knees buckled. The strength left his limbs as if the iron within him had suddenly liquefied. Before he could strike the earth, Iphicrates, who had been watching him with the predatory intensity of a mentor, stepped in, his strong, callous hands catching the boy by the shoulders. "Steady, Prince," Iphicrates commanded, his voice surprisingly grounded, the weight of the Athenian support anchoring Philip as his vision flickered out and the silence of the aftermath claimed him. Philip was not merely asleep, he was unmoored. He drifted above the world, suspended in a suffocating silver-gray void that possessed neither temperature nor wind, only an absolute crushing indifference. It was a blank canvas of existence, utterly empty. And as he descended, he knew with a sickening primal certainty that he was not falling. He was being pulled by an invisible, inexorable tether. He landed on the bank of the Haliacmon. But this was not the river. He had just turned into a slaughterhouse. This was a mirror image, a twisted, stagnant reflection. The water did not ripple. It flowed like molten mercury, thick, dense, and unnaturally smooth. He stood on the muddy, pebble-strewn bank, the silence pressing against his eardrums until they hummed. He was the only living thing in a world that existed solely to document the dead. Across the mercury current, shadows began to coalesce, figures of gray, vaporous smoke that moved like liquid thought. He squinted, his breath catching. There was his brother Alexander, his features blurred as if viewed through rain. From behind him, another figure emerged, his father, Amyntas, stern and regal, even in death. Behind them stretched a vast, silent congregation of ancestors, an endless line of kings and warriors impossible to count. And then, at the rear of this ghostly procession, a silhouette of impossible grandeur stood, a figure of Olympian scale, radiating the ancient heavy power of Heracles. Philip felt a magnetic, irresistible pull toward them. He stepped into the river, but the mercury was not water. It was viscous and clingy, pulling at his boots like living tar. The silver flow rose, swirling around his knees, dragging at him with a density that felt like it was trying to claim his very blood. Driven by a compulsion that felt like cold wire wrapped around his spine, he struggled forward, his eyes locked on his ancestors. But as he looked past them, his focus shifted to the opposing bank, which was carpeted in a gruesome, tangled sprawl, countless bodies, the very men he had helped slaughter just hours ago. Then the silver of the river began to bleed. The mercury dulled, shifting first to a pale, bruised wine, then curdling rapidly into a deep arterial mulberry. The darkness deepened, swelling into a thick, wet crimson that pulsed with the rhythm of an exposed heart. With the color came the smell, the sweet, cloying, wrought heavy stench of fresh slaughter rising up from the water, hot and stagnant, coating the back of Philip's throat like grave dirt. The dead did not stay still. They stirred. They rose with a mechanical, jerky grace, their movements fluid and weightless, like dying jellyfish drifting through dark subterranean water. They stood on broken limbs that bent at impossible, agonizing angles. They had no eyes, only empty, weeping sockets where the light had been extinguished and replaced by a hollow, infinite hunger. Some had skulls crushed like eggshells, leaking gray matter that hung in wet, viscous strings from their ears. Philip backed away, stumbling on the slick, mercurial mud, but the bank was no longer empty. The living dead were everywhere, surrounding him, a silent, grasping legion of the butchered. They clawed at him with dead gray fingers, their movements synchronized in a horrific, rhythmic dance. He felt the cold, clammy pressure of their touch on his skin, a sensation of absolute, unfeeling hunger that seeped through his tunic and straight into his marrow. He shivered, spinning around as they closed in, a suffocating wall of gore and broken bone. Then the command tore through the stagnant air, not a human voice, but a cacophony of 1,000 wet, rattling breaths. There is the crown. Aim for the golden banner. Philip froze, realizing with a jolt of pure, frigid horror that he was not an observer. He was the objective. He was the quarry. The legion shifted, their hollow sockets fixing upon him with a predatory collective intent, their fingers hooked into claws. He let out a ragged, silent scream as their cold, dead grip tightened around his throat, the pressure squeezing the very essence of his life into a narrowing, dark point. Philip. Philip, wake up. Awake, you're having bad dreams. Wake up! Eurydice's voice cut through the dark like a jagged blade, frantic and trembling. Philip gasped, his eyes snapping open to the flickering amber light of the tent, his chest heaving as if he were still drowning in that red, suffocating abyss. His skin felt coated in the phantom ice of the dead, and even as the world returned, the phantom weight of those clawing, rotted fingers still lingered, ghost cold against his neck. Philip stood beneath the colossal, enveloping shadow of a gnarled oak that dominated the ridge, his gaze fixed on the visceral tapestry of the floodplain below. He wasn't watching a battle, he was watching an autopsy. The data filtering behind his retinas bore no resemblance to the gilded, artificial glory traditional court scribes archived within dynastic mythologies. He was clinically decoding the unremitting operations of an immaculate piece of machinery. He dissected the utility of the layered linen linothoraxes worn by the Athenian peltists, an apparatus engineered to preserve their stamina to the bone, and analyzed how the cold geometry of position and spear length transformed a chaotic melee into a predictable ledger of execution. Attalus and Parmenion paced a few steps behind him, their boots crunching softly on the blood-dampened grass. Their presence was a steady, grounding weight, yet Philip felt untethered, his mind still cycling through the bloody math of the morning. "The usurper," Philip said, his voice stripping away the artifice of the victory. "Did you find him? Is Pausanias among the dead?" Iphicrates stepped forward, his expression as unreadable as a slab of quarried marble. "No, Prince. The man is a coward. He fled before the circle fully closed. He slipped through the gaps like smoke. He lives to fester," Philip thought, the coldness in his gut sharpening. "He's a loose thread in the tapestry of the north." Parmenion's hand rested on the hilt of his sword, his eyes scouring the broken field where the carnage had been most dense. "A rat that knows the tunnels," the general muttered, a hint of grudging respect in his tone. He did not fight for honor. He fought to preserve his own skin. "Honor is a luxury of the victor," Parmenion Attalus added, his voice raspy. He looked at the field, at the thousands of men who had died for a man who had abandoned them to the Athenian spears. "Pausanias has traded his legitimacy for a few more days of breathing. He is no longer a king, he is a ghost." Philip remained silent, his mind still tracing the long, lethal lines of the Athenian Cerissus. Geometry, he thought. If Iphicrates can dismantle a man with math, I can dismantle a kingdom with the same. "Let him run," Philip finally said, turning away from the ridge. "He will find that the further he runs, the smaller his shadow becomes. When we move, we won't need to hunt for him. He will be waiting for us in the ruins of his own making." He began the descent toward the mud-slicked plain, his steps measured and deliberate. Behind him, the seasoned generals exchanged a brief, silent look, a mixture of wary apprehension and dawning, terrifying recognition. The boy was gone. In his place walked a student who had already mastered the master. Yet, no matter how clinically the 14-year-old prince's inner intellect logos operated, his uncultivated, juvenile flesh, sarx, violently rebelled against the sheer kinetic mass of the reality before him. A raw, heavy wave of nausea surged forcefully up his throat. The atmosphere was darkly compressed by the suffocation of sweat and the iron tang of bronze, overlaid by an unencountered predatory stench, the warm exhalation of ruptured intestines, voided waste, and rapidly congealing blood. This was an unmitigated violation of his five senses, fundamentally severed from the pristine letters of statecraft or the sanitized choreography of palace training. At the absolute flashpoint of the initial charge, a severe shock rippled down the youth's spine as he witnessed how effortlessly the human frame breaks under calculation. Every time an iron spear point punched through a breastplate, a sickening sound akin to the tearing of wet linen and the splintering of bone saturated the plain. A severed human arm tumbled into the mud, its fingers still contracting in a residual spasm, while a disemboweled warhorse thrashed frantically in the silt, its own entrails wrapping around its thrashing hooves. Philip's teeth clicked together out of pure biological reflex. He fought desperately to suppress the sour sting of bile rising in his mouth, forcing his knees to cease their erratic micro-vibrations. A violent vertigo bleached his vision, compelling him to lean his entire weight onto the shaft of the training spear at his feet. His fingertips lost all color, his nails cutting deep into the raw wood. Yet he did not avert his eyes. He chose to look. He was forbidden from turning away. At this precise juncture of the grand chessboard, he was not yet the sovereign of Macedonia. The throne was occupied by his eldest brother Perdiccas, and he existed merely within the margins as a secondary reserve lineage. His absolute immediate obligation was not to dream of a future crown, but to survive this blood-soaked theater of campaigns and rapidly molt into a Macedonian general capable of reinforcing the king's flank. In a Macedonia permanently surrounded by starving wolves, a commander who faltered before the visceral reality of slaughter was a corpse. He must register zero surprise. He must execute zero retreat. He had to maintain a freezing, absolute detachment, preserving a calm, undisturbed matrix of calculation, even when backed into the most desperate and volatile corridors of the board. Forcing the foul lump back down his throat with a swallow of dry saliva, Philip consciously accepted the grotesque panorama, integrating the bloody, merciless reality into his own entity. He ceased resisting the biological revulsion of his flesh. He refused to fly from the carnage or filter the view. He stared directly at the ruptured viscera and the severed limbs tumbling into the mud, systematically parsing and sorting them into the catalog of his memory. Stripping away the emotional markers of terror and disgust, he archived the data as pure phenomenon, as mechanical components of a larger tactical apparatus, recording it coldly onto the ledger of his intellect. The instant his mind achieved this definitive, unyielding detachment, the shock paralyzing his body inverted entirely into a bizarre, highly clear intellectual intoxication that separated his mind from his physical frame. Pausanias sustained this undoing because Philip squeezed the words through his teeth, conquering the taste of sand and blood lingering on his palate. He clamped his jaws shut against the residual tremors, forcing his voice to maintain a low clinical tone to ensure the general beside him registered zero vulnerability. Because you refused to engage his main vanguard head-on, or rather, you forbade him from ever engaging yours, General. Beside him, General Iphicrates caught the whisper, shifting only his profile to drop a clinical glance onto the youth. Along the absolute periphery of his vision, Philip tracked the corpse of a rebel soldier lying in the adjacent mire, his face split vertically in half by a 12-foot ash shaft, his eyes rolled back into a blank stare. Consciously locking his focus away from the leaking gray brain matter soaking into the dry dirt, the prince fixed his eyes unblinkingly onto the profile of Iphicrates. He forcefully mastered his chest wall, clamping down on his lungs to prevent his respiration from fracturing into shallow, rapid gasps. You targeted his stomach, his logistics, Philip continued, anchoring his torso by driving his weight harder into the training spear as his stomach muscles experienced another minor spasm. You completely crushed his baggage train under the veil of night, and before he could realign his forces for a counterstrike, you vanished instantly like mist. A sharp light of supreme validation flickered across Iphicrates' eyes, a faint smile touching his lips. The 14-year-old prince's face was as pale as a corpse, thoroughly drained of blood by terror and the stench of the field, yet his slate-gray pupils were cleanly piercing the geostrategic core of the campaign. The veteran general experienced a strange, unearthly ripple of unease, overlaid by a profound satisfaction at the distorted architecture of the boy's intellect. Intellect, logos, is the longest spear in the arsenal of any commander. Philip, the Athenian titan, responded, his low voice testing the balance of his own weapon. The barons of your nation yearn only to stand rigid in a single coordinate, screaming their primitive, individual prowess to the heavens. But the absolute essence of warfare is never brute courage. It is speed, the absolute dominance of space, and the unyielding range generated by your own two arms. The wind shifted its alignment across the ridge, carrying a denser, heavier putrefaction from the loop of the Haliacmon, the musk of raw meat left to bake beneath a summer sun. Philip's nasal passages instinctively tightened, the muscles of his throat threatening to invert once more. He forced his spine into an unnaturally rigid posture, aggressively drawing the cold air deep into his lungs to mute the physical screaming of his body. The intellect of the future general had completely wrested dominance back from the flesh. Is that the baseline mechanics of how a true warrior commands, General? Philip turned his neck, deliberately directing the inquiry toward Attalus, who stood rigid on his other flank. It was a desperate, calculated maneuver to insulate his mind from the hell tracked by his eyes and nose, forcing his consciousness to ground itself within the structural architecture of language. Attalus spat violently into the dust of the ridge, his face twisting into the harsh, unyielding mask of the old Highland aristocracy. "It is the cynical sophistry of a mere butcher boy," Attalus barked, his bronze cuirass ringing as he shifted his bulk. Assaulting a man's rear under the cover of dark, executing a slaughter from afar with missiles, there is zero pride within this framework. Authentic warfare is the direct collision of shields, pressing forward through raw muscle at the hazard of your own life. Listening to the Baron's declaration, Philip clinically observed a fragment of flesh of anonymous origin baking near Attalus's boots, tracking the rhythmic buzzing of the large black flies beginning to swarm over it. Pride, he evaluated. His eyes registered zero traces of a noble, pristine pride rotting in the dirt. The reality offered nothing but crimson air and a stacked accumulation of mutilated meat. If any high-born men harboring Attalus's definition of pride had stood upon that plain today, they were now universally reduced to nothing more than a feast for the crows. A general destined to govern could never allow his intellect to be martyred by such an illusion. Pride did not conquer that floodplain, General Attalus, Philip declared coldly. His gaze remained seamlessly anchored to the dull, rhythmic glint of the 12-foot spears wielded by the Athenian vanguard. Every trace of his previous tremor, every rasp of suppressed nausea had vanished from his tone, replaced by the freezing resonance of an intellect analyzing a numerical formula. Pausanias's mercenaries carried spears of 8 feet. The extra 4 feet of timber managed by those peltists is the solitary variable that violently extracted the sovereignty of that field. In that exact fraction of a second, the mythological dream of heroes crossing swords in beautiful, symmetrical duels, an illusion archived deep within his childhood memory, was thoroughly pulverized into splinters. And upon the ash of that ruin, a completely fresh, terrifying vision materialized. He hallucinated a future battlefield, where a compressed line of colossal spears, a phalanx, and the kinetic weight of a massive heavy cavalry functioned as a singular, integrated weapon system of absolute destruction. The warhorse was no longer a mere beast engineered to carry a rider. It was a calibrated instrument of kinetic force designed to break the structural alignment of enemy shields down to their foundations. As the echoes of the dying subsided into a low vibration, leaving only the ominous flapping of crows' wings to dominate the perimeter, Philip initiated his descent from the ridge. The battlefield of the Haliacmon River was unmitigated as a charnel house, yet his internal matrix held zero traces of the uncultivated aristocratic disgust managed by Attalus. Having successfully converted the initial shock into cold clinical arithmetic within his brain, his intellect analyzed those remnants with the terrifying curiosity of a master artisan appraising raw materials. He halted his stride at the primary line of engagement, where the mercenaries of the usurper lay slaughtered in an immaculate, uniform row, like stalks of wheat, cleanly reaped before a massive scythe. A dense, visceral stench of ruptured organs was the first to assault him. As the distant echoes of the pursuit dissolved into the humid air, Philip dropped his gaze to the mud, then traced it slowly toward the sky, decoding the lethal vectors left by the slaughter. A freezing truth permanently anchored itself within the deep furnace of the youth's mind. "Look closely at that interval, Attalus," Philip said, his voice maintaining an uncanny, freezing serenity. He dropped his knee onto the blood-slicked mud directly beside the corpse of a mercenary whose larynx had been cleanly transfixed by an iron point. The man's standard 8-foot spear lay just inches from his limp fingers, reduced now to an absurdly short, useless length of timber. Philip extended his hand, lightly touching the blood-smeared bark of the enemy weapon. He never possessed the mathematical capacity to reach the Athenian line. He perished at the extreme margin of range, chasing nothing but a phantom of survival. Philip reached out and gripped a discarded Athenian spear, the 12-foot ash weapon wielded by the light infantry. He braced it vertically against the earth, its lethal point towered and swayed dangerously high above his 14-year-old frame. Do you perceive it? This mercenary collapsed before he could even draw close enough to register the foul breath of the man killing him. He was systematically butchered within this hollow expanse of space. Space is the empty jargon of poets, Philip, Attalus rumbled, stepping heavily over the corpses, his voice raw and abrasive. The bedrock of warfare is unyielding courage. Any man who cannot force his way inside the enemy's reach is simply a coward. A silent, biting contempt flickered through the margins of Philip's intellect. To his mind, warfare was no grand theater engineered to illuminate noble valor. It was a clinical calculus designed to systematically extinguish a human heartbeat with absolute efficiency. He dragged a standard Macedonian spear through the silt and aligned it flat beside the Athenian weapon. The disparity was total. The Athenian asset loomed over the other like a blacksmith's hammer resting beside a child's toy. Directly beside his boots, a fallen mercenary was still drawing shallow, erratic breaths, his features horribly contorted by the trauma of his broken flesh. A wet, rattling gasp of absolute despair escaped his throat. "Leave him to rot in his own agony," Attalus muttered, spitting into the mud. He raised his spear against the throne. "It is the proper ledger for treason." Philip stared at the dying man, then shifted his gaze back to the general. His pupils did not register a rebel soldier. They noted only the broken components of an obsolete, failed engine. Without exchanging a solitary syllable, the young prince retrieved a heavy, shattered spearhead from the dirt and, with an explosive lightning movement, executed a definitive termination of the man's agony. It was born of zero mercy. It was exclusively the application of absolute efficiency. The coward with the superior range survives to boast of his valor, while the brave man lies here draining his life into the mud, Attalus, solely because his timber was exactly 4 feet too short. Philip whispered low. "If I command 1,000 men wielding this colossus, and you command 1,000 men wielding your standard spear, your line will be reduced entirely to corpses in the expanse of space exactly 4 feet before your vanguard can ever plant a single point into my flesh." As the dust began to settle across the plain, Iphicrates approached, a thin, approving smile touching the corners of his lips. Thoroughly unhinged by the clinical, flawless precision of the Athenian strategy, Attalus turned on his heel with an arrogant stride, leaving the young prince alone with the victor. "Young prince," Iphicrates murmured, his low voice slipping into a fluid, elegant friction. "How does your mind archive this wreckage? You stand there, resembling a frozen shadow. The abyss of Hades has just erupted its viscera across this earth. It is only natural for the mind to sustain a severe bruise." Philip looked up at the veteran commander whom his father had legally claimed as a brother. "I experienced the sensation of standing within a strange margin, a gray territory. I perceive the raw reality of the blood, yet it slips through my senses like the phantom of a heavy fever. When the world transforms entirely into a slaughterhouse within a single day, I have not yet decoded what an Argead is supposed to feel." "That is the purchase price, Philip," Iphicrates responded, placing a heavy, calloused palm onto the youth's shoulders, anchoring him back to the material weight of the earth. "That is the exact, merciless price demanded of anyone extracted from the Argead line. Your eldest brother, Alexander, has been butchered. Your secondary brother, Perdiccas, must now bear the absolute mass of a fractured crown upon his shoulders. And you must transform yourself into the raw steel, inside the iron gauntlet they wear." The general leaned closer, dropping his voice into a whisper. "Your mother is preparing to deploy you into the wolf's lair of Thebes, not to be consumed, but to extract their secrets. Within that city, you will clinically study the absolute discipline of the sacred band and the supreme genius of Epaminondas. Dissect their drills. Transform your entity into a monumental sponge." Philip directed his gaze onto the dark, churning surface of the river, which glinted like dark wine beneath the fading light. "The boy remains here, abandoned upon this ridge," Philip said. "The entity departing for Thebes as a soldier." The departure from the Haliacmon did not feel like a triumph. As the dust settled over the valley, it left behind a hollow, predatory silence. The victory, achieved with the surgical, terrifying efficiency of a mathematician's ledger, felt irrevocably alien. It was clean, clinical, and soaked in a visceral, soul-drenching fatigue that had begun the moment Alexander II died. Since that initial loss, the march had been a relentless, spirit-breaking erosion. The funeral dirges, the Illyrian fire ambushes in the dark, the constant, jagged harassment of their flanks, and the looming apocalyptic shadow of a Pella under siege. They were a haunted procession, walking through a world that had thinned and stretched until it felt like a ghost path, disconnected from the reality they had known before the throne became a prize to be fought over in the mud. As the sun touched the horizon, the fragmentation of their force began. 2/3 of the Athenian host and the bulk of their maritime fleet detached, their sails catching the offshore wind as they retreated toward the coast. They left behind only a skeletal force: Iphicrates, his elite commanders, and the disciplined, wary vanguards of the Thebans. Iphicrates stood near the riverbank, his presence looming over the remaining camp. He watched the Athenian sails fade into the evening mist with a detached appraisal of a master craftsman seeing a tool return to its casing. He turned, his gaze sweeping over the Theban vanguards, men who stood with a rigid, unnatural stillness, before his eyes settled on the young prince. "They take the gold and the ships with them," Iphicrates remarked, his voice a low, abrasive rasp that seemed to catch on the heavy, rot-laden air. "The Athenians have little interest in governing ruins. They leave the heavy work of reconstruction to those who still have a stake in the dirt." Philip remained mounted, his hands gripping the reins until his knuckles turned bloodless. He looked at the Theban vanguards, those cold, iron-willed soldiers of Epaminondas, and felt the crushing weight of his future shifting. He was being handed over to the very men who held the secrets of the phalanx he had just obsessed over. "The landscape has changed, General," Philip murmured, his voice steady despite the tremor in his limbs. "The usurper is gone, but the kingdom is bleeding out. And now, we are led by those who look through us rather than at us." Iphicrates offered a thin, mirthless smile. "Thebes does not care if you bleed, Prince. They only care if you learn. If you can withstand the instruction of Epaminondas, you will find that the exhaustion you feel now is nothing compared to the clarity that comes from being forged in that furnace." As the march toward Pella resumed, the column moved with the precision of a clockwork mechanism. They were heading toward a city of dust and debris, a broken capital that had spent its strength in a siege that now felt like a fever dream. Ahead, Pella waited, not as a sanctuary, but as a final, ruined test of their endurance. Philip stared straight ahead, his eyes fixed on the horizon, realizing he was no longer a prince in his own land, but an apprentice to an apocalypse, destined to bury the remnants of his youth beneath the foundations of a new, absolute machine. To be continued in episode 37, Two City Gates. A Great Argead Saga Alexein. Volume 1, Telesias, The War Dance. A new episode every single day. We are dropping a new episode every day until the epic conclusion of Volume 1. Each chapter delivers a tight, hyper-focused 5 to 15-minute hit of cinematic historical drama, perfect for your daily plunge into antiquity. Watch the cinematic video trailer. Listen to the full saga now. Bookmark Volume 1, Telesias playlist. Subscribe to follow the rise of the Argead dynasty. Thumbs up to help push our vanguard through the algorithm's gauntlet. Comment below.